Welcome to AP Environmental Science. In this video, we are going to talk a little bit about urbanization. Now, urbanization is this overall trend of moving towards cities and away from rural communities. Now, keep in mind, not all cities are large. In fact, many cities are quite small. And these are really characterized by the majority of the population working these non-agricultural jobs. So a shift from an agriculture-based society to a non-agricultural society. Additionally, the land in the city is going to be multi-use, so perhaps you will see a business on the first floor, and the second and third floors of the building would be apartment space or other types of use. We're also going to see more mass transit within cities. Perhaps that is a bus system or a high-speed rail system. Typically, cities are also going to be more walkable. So instead of having cars as your major form of transit, people are tending to walk more places. And additionally, cities are really characterized by this high density human population. Also, when we're looking at urbanization, we're looking at these shifts in demographic transition. So as a country becomes more industrialized, we start to see this shift into the cities and this higher concentration of humans. In the United States, though, we are experiencing this very rapid urbanization. So we're seeing a lot of our urban areas start to spread out into the surrounding countryside, and that's what's called urban sprawl. And eventually, many of the cities in the United States have spread so far that they have reached into the outward spread of a different city. Now, there are some benefits to urbanization. So when everything is closer together, you don't have to travel as far from where you live to where you work. That means less fossil fuel usage, and we're going to minimize that impact on the land. Mass transit is also much more feasible in an urbanized environment because the people are closer together. And this provides many benefits from an environmental perspective, such as less fossil fuel use and that better use of space. However, there are many drawbacks to urbanization, and we're going to go through each of these one at a time. I just wanted to lay it out so you know where we're headed. The first drawback that we're going to talk about are some of these impacts on the water cycle. So of course, if you have a lot of humans living in close proximity, you're going to have a lot of waste in a concentrated area. Now we're going to also have this higher demand for water in that concentrated area. So we have more water pollution potential from this concentrated human population, but we also have a higher water use potential. Now, in order to get that water for that huge population, you're going to have to divert that water in or pump that water up from the aquifer underground. Now, this is going to impact organisms upstream and downstream from that water diversion, and it could impact the aquifer itself. And that can lead to what's called saltwater intrusion. Now, saltwater intrusion only is a major factor in cities that are near a saltwater body, so near the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean in the United States or some other coastal community. Now, what happens with saltwater intrusion, and that's this image here in the right-hand side of your screen, is that the well, which is that white column there, is pumping the water up out of that freshwater aquifer. However, since that aquifer is close to the ocean, you're going to also be pulling some salt water in from the ocean towards that well. And now, if you are pulling more fresh water out than can be replenished from the freshwater size, you're going to see that salt water come in or intrude onto that freshwater well. Now, here's the problem. You don't want to drink salt water. That's not very good for human health. And it's also extremely expensive to remediate a well that's been contaminated by salt water. So the main goal in these coastal communities is to prevent saltwater intrusion from happening in the first place. Some other impacts would be the number of impermeable surfaces in an urban environment. So urban areas are really characterized by these hard surfaces, things like asphalt and concrete and the roof shingles on buildings. these are all preventing that water from seeping through the soil back into the groundwater or into the aquifer. Another impact from these impermeable surfaces would be an increase in the amount of runoff off of that surface. And that water that hits that impermeable surface will quickly move across that surface and often into stormwater drains, which is that picture on the bottom. Now these stormwater drains concentrate that water and send it down a pipe directly out into a river or stream or water body. Now the issue here is you're going to very quickly move that water from the surface into that pipe and out into the water body, and that leads to some very fast increases in water levels due to those rain events. Now normally if you had less impermeable surfaces, that water would slowly seep into the soil and slowly move towards that water body, so we wouldn't see these fast increases in water levels. So if we look at this image here, on the left-hand side of the screen, you see the impermeable or impervious surfaces. You can see that water is moving very quickly across the surface, and that's going to lead to those flash floods. Whereas if you implement what's called this smart infrastructure or green infrastructure, you will increase your permeable or pervious surfaces, and that actually slows down that water flow. And that's what we're going to talk about when we look at the remediation or solutions to urbanization. Urbanization also impacts the carbon cycle. Now remember, the term anthropogenic means it is caused by humans. So there are many anthropogenic influences on the carbon cycle, particularly from burning fossil fuels. Now, if you have an urban environment, you have more humans concentrated, and there tends to be a higher demand for the energy from these fossil fuels. Now, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas that is produced during the combustion of these fossil fuels. And as you burn fossil fuels, you also release the impurities into the air, and that leads to air pollution. Now, if we look at this map, the red areas, those tend to be associated with urban regions of the United States, and the green areas are much more rural. Now this map is looking at emissions of fossil fuel carbon dioxide, particularly from the transportation sector. And you can see that there's these red lines crisscrossing the United States, and that's associated with interstate highways. Now, another anthropogenic impact on the carbon cycle is actually the impact of all of the waste from humans breaking down in landfills. Now, as waste breaks down, it releases carbon dioxide, but it also releases methane, which is CH4. So both carbon dioxide and methane are greenhouse gases, and that's something we should be concerned about. Again, as I mentioned, urbanization also leads to air pollution. Now remember, air is a global commons, so the air pollution in one area is not going to stay there. It will spread throughout the entire globe. Now these images that I included on here, these are images from Sequoia National Park, and you can see that this is located just to the northeast of Fresno in California. And if you look at that map in the lower left-hand corner, you can see that there's a lot of air pollution that is trapped in the central California valley that gets pushed inland through the valleys into the area that constitutes Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks. That's actually in one of the purple regions on that map. You can see that there's actually more unhealthy air days in this national park than there is in the city of Los Angeles. So even though we're not producing this air pollution in the park, we're still seeing that impact. Another issue to be concerned about with urbanization is this concept called urban sprawl. So as more people want to live in the city, there's not as many places to live, so then they're going to settle just outside the city, so they have that quick access. Now, if that urban area is not planned, we're going to see a lot of deforestation, a lot of inadequate planning, and inadequate design of where these suburbs are located, and that leads to some pretty serious issues. Now this picture on the bottom, for that particular city, you see this large expanse of suburbs, and it seems to go on endlessly. And that's actually the case in more cities than not within the United States. I also want to talk a little bit about this positive feedback loop at the top of the screen. This is looking at how having this urban sprawl leads to this feedback loop that leads to more urban sprawl. So we have more congestion on the highways, so people are going to be driving for longer, which means they use more gas, which means that we're going to have more revenue from paying for that gas. So the taxes on the gas are going to be used to build more highways. So we build more highways, now the suburbs expand even further, and that means we have more traffic congestion. And this loop keeps going, and the suburbs just keep expanding. And that leads to some pretty significant issues. Now here are some causes of urban sprawl. I am not going to go through all of them for the sake of time. However, I recommend you pause the video and just read through these. You do not need to write all of these down, just maybe a brief note of each of the 3 main points on here. There are also several health effects of urban sprawl. These are primarily associated with that increase in air pollution from all of the extra traffic congestion and that commuter lifestyle. So the commuter lifestyle means that these individuals that live further out in the suburbs tend to spend more time in their car, so that means they are not exercising as much, and they tend to have poor diets because they don't have as much time at home to prepare healthy meals. Again, I encourage you to pause this video, read through the bullet points on here, and just take brief notes. Again, you do not need to write down everything, just read through it. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about urban blight. Urban blight is this degradation of that urban core, and this leads to white flight, or the movement of people away from that urban center out into the suburbs. Now what happens here is a urban area has some kind of shift out to the suburbs. And if you have more people moving to the suburbs because they're perceived as being better, you're going to have a decrease in tax revenues that are generated within that urban area, which means you're not going to have as many services available. So fewer bus routes, less funding towards schools, less funding towards community services. And so the people that live there and the customers for those businesses are all going to leave, and then you have these abandoned buildings, and that neighborhood starts to decline, which causes more people to panic and leave that urban area. Now this is again a positive feedback loop that really is detrimental to an urban area. Another issue that I want to briefly discuss here is the idea of heat islands. So a heat island is this idea that an urban area tends to be much warmer than a outside natural area, so an area just outside of the city. And this is primarily due to the albedo of the surfaces in that city. So the impermeable surfaces of the city tend to decrease albedo, which means they are absorbing more of that energy from the sunlight and they're retaining that heat. So if you have less light reflected, you have more heat absorbed, which means the urban area has higher temperatures than, say, a park just outside of the city. And this leads to some interesting impacts as well within the urban area, and we'll get into those later in the course. Finally, there are ways to remediate a lot of these issues associated with urban areas. And I listed them here on this slide. Primarily, they're things like plant more trees and have more mass transit available to the suburbs to try to reduce the amount of congestion on the roads. Also using things like permeable pavement, which allows that water to seep through the ground and slowly return to the aquifer. Also, another big key piece of urban remediation would be smart growth. And I have that here on our next slide. Smart growth is also called sustainable urban development, and there's several pieces involved here. Things from addressing transportation issues, to tax incentives, to zoning, and increasing the amenities. Now, I'm not going to go into detail of each of these pieces here on this slide. However, I encourage you to read through your textbook that really goes in depth on smart growth. Briefly, I want to talk about these images here. This is showing the contrast between traditional urban planning and smart growth, or that sustainable urban design. You can see that in the traditional side, we have that large big box store surrounded by a massive parking lot and some strip malls. Now you could have that same area of land with those same businesses plus a whole bunch of residential and park-like areas all in that same space. And that's using this idea of growing up instead of growing out. So you can see some of these differences in the two pictures. Now in summary, and I know this was a huge amount of information very quickly, you should be able to define urbanization and urban sprawl and some of those pros and cons associated with urbanization. Also be able to describe some of those ways to remediate the drawbacks of urbanization, particularly understanding how smart growth makes cities more sustainable. Again, please leave your questions here at the end, and I hope that as you watch this video, you were able to learn something.